This is Ankapsu, and now we're going to talk about two polls that came out today. One from Datafolha says that the majority of Brazilians agree with Bolsonaro's house arrest, and another from Atlas Intel says exactly the opposite, that the majority are against Bolsonaro's house arrest, right? In other words, how curious these polls are. But actually, both show the same thing, the same result. In other words, everything is tied here. Brazil is divided on this issue with the judiciary, which clearly shows that it might seem like, no, see? If it's divided, then we've lost. I don't know about that. No. If it's divided, we win. Because, as I told you, the whole objective of the judiciary of Alexandre de Moraes with this process was to make the Brazilian people hate Bolsonaro. No, because Bolsonaro is a coup monger who ruined Brazil and whatever else, wanted to stage a coup. That's what they wanted. If the people are still divided, they didn't achieve that, right? This shows their failure in that task. Let's take a look at these polls here. The Atlas Intel poll is actually quite interesting, okay? It's actually pretty funny how people try to see something positive, right? Moraes is the STF minister with the most positive image, says Atlas Bloomberg. Yeah, but it's still negative. People still think he's worse than they think he's good, you know? He's the most positive because the others are rated even worse, right? Let's understand this case here. This news was suggested by Sincericidio Mata, Daniel Fraga will always be remembered, and several other people. Thanks to everyone who suggested news on our website at visãolibertaria.com, and thank you for watching our video. If you like our content, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, okay? Well then, Datafolha is all proud here. See, Trump is wrong. 51% of Brazilians agree that Bolsonaro should be arrested, says Datafolha. You know, Datafolha does these surveys at the entrance of prisons, right? It's always been like that, hasn't it? And in the end, what it shows here is that everything is divided in the end, right? In other words, 53% think that Moraes is acting appropriately, which means the rest, 47%, do not. Brazil is divided. Atlas Intel's view is basically the same, just flipped a bit, but both are within the margin of error here. The survey shows that 52% reject the Supreme Court's decision to arrest Bolsonaro, while 47% support the measure. That's the conclusion from Atlas Intel, which might seem different from Datafolha here, but it's really not that different, because it's 51% on one side, 49% on the other. Here it was 52% on one side, 47% on the other. In other words, both are basically the same, everything is very close. The truth is, the Brazilian people are divided on this issue. That's the conclusion you reach from these surveys, right? And well, they certainly did this survey with the idea of improving the Supreme Court's image, right? As you know, now that Trump has raised the issue of human rights at the Supreme Court, the people at the Supreme Court have realized the problem, right? Because in their little bubble, everyone thinks they're doing everything right? People love it. Go on, Xandão, go after Bolsonaro, Xandão, go after the Bolsonaro supporters, Xandão. In their little bubble, everything is perfect and everyone thinks it's all wonderful and amazing. But now that this guy here broke through the bubble, that Trump put the recommendation in the report, imposed sanctions against the Supreme Court, included in the report that Brazil is violating human rights, right? Put everything in there, people had to justify themselves, right? Then they start with this justification that, no, first they brought in some famous writers, right? Paul Krugman, I don't even know who else, to say that no, the left is right, that democracy only exists when the left is in power, otherwise it's a dictatorship and so on. These people are as outdated as the left itself. It's a sign of the left's desperation, right? And now they're moving on to the polls, right? They conducted the Datafolha poll. As I said, the two polls are actually very similar in this regard. Whether people agree or not with Bolsonaro's arrest, it shows that Brazil is its tide. And here's what I tell you. This might seem like a positive thing for Alexandre de Moraes, but it's not. It shows that Brazil is divided here, just as expected, right? In other words, and if you look at the Atlas Intel poll, this becomes even clearer. The split is exactly between the people who watch television and those who go online. It's the same thing, exactly that division. Anyway, the Atlas Intel poll shows the same thing, a divided country, and once again it highlights how flawed their strategy was, right? When Bolsonaro won in 2018, they thought he was an underdog, that he wouldn't even be able to govern, that he'd end up giving up and all that, right? But that didn't happen. Bolsonaro stood firm in office, right? They tried hard to bring him down from the government. Remember the case with the doorman at Bolsonaro's condo? You know, they made up that Marielle Franco's killer went in and asked to speak with Bolsonaro and all that, but there was nothing like that, my friend. Then Bolsonaro showed the recording from the intercom where the doorman said there was nothing like that, right? Anyway, that's the situation, right? They tried to bring him down. Then, did you see that he didn't fall? Then came the pandemic. Now, with the pandemic, he's going down for sure. There's no way out. Bolsonaro didn't fall during the pandemic. Then the alarm went off for these people like, wow, that's it, it's over. No, there's nothing. They're not going to bring Bolsonaro down. There's nothing that can bring Bolsonaro down. The guy has a lot of support from the people. So then they moved on to the plan of reviving Lula, the ghost of Lula, right? They brought back the politically dead zombie of Lula, revived the guy because he was the only one who had a chance to take Bolsonaro out in 2022, and they did everything, absolutely everything they could, even what they shouldn't have, to try to win the 2022 election. They won. But then they thought that by winning the election, that was it. Bolsonaro was out, now he'd lose support, nobody would want him anymore, and so on. And that's not what happened, right? Again, Bolsonaro continued to have a lot of support. So yeah, they made him ineligible. Nothing changed. No, but they accused him of a bunch of things. Nothing changed. And then they pulled the coup thing. It was supposed to be a master stroke. No, they're saying Bolsonaro will be jailed for 30 years because he supposedly attempted a coup where the taxi driver fell asleep and that ended the coup because the taxi driver fell asleep and whatever else. An absurd fiction that makes no sense at all in this story. And not even that makes people stop liking Bolsonaro. This poll here is bad for them. They thought that by now they'd be able to get everyone to unanimously condemn Bolsonaro, to say he's a criminal and all that. Remember that when Lula was prosecuted in the car wash operation, only 30% still supported him. The 30% from the PT kept supporting Lula, but the rest of the entire Brazilian population ended up supporting Lula's imprisonment. Everyone thought the corruption in the car wash scandal was outrageous. At that moment, Lula was really convicted because of that. But why? Because, as I tell you, with decentralized information, being grounded in reality is important. Lula really is a thief, a corrupt man. All of that really happened, that Petrobras corruption. So there was no way to cover that up, right? It became clear that this was the problem. In Bolsonaro's case, they're making all this up. Can this fool some people? Of course. People who are already on the left, who don't like Bolsonaro, of course they're going to be fooled. Now, the majority of people, it doesn't work on them, right? Actually, this survey shows the failure of their attempt, right? Besides that, there are some interesting things in this Atlas Intel survey. Here it is. Look, the press trying to go easy on Moraes, right? Moraes is the minister with the most positive image, says Atlas Intel. Wow, unbelievable. So does that mean people like Moraes? No, they don't. It's just that the others are even worse. So here it is, look. 51% are against, have a negative view of Alexandre de Moraes. 49% have a positive view. He's the guy there's no doubt about. Why? Because it's obvious, right? He's the guy who's on TV all the time. So everyone has an opinion about Alexandre de Moraes and most are against him, think he's wrong, right? Once again, it's divided. All the others here, Carmen Lucia as well, all the others have an even more negative image and an even lower positive image, right? Particularly noteworthy are Gilmar Mendes and Barroso, whose negative to positive ratio is even higher, right? You see how this thing about ministers speaking out only makes their situation worse. That's what I keep telling you. A minister should be as discreet as possible, speak as little as possible. The moment they start talking a lot, they end up saying nonsense, end up displeasing everyone, and even corrupting the idea of justice. The idea of justice is not to do politics. If Gilmar Mendes keeps doing politics 24 hours a day, and Barroso keeps saying things like, oh, you lost, man, we defeated Bolsonarism and all that, obviously that reflects badly on them, right? So both Barroso and Gilmar Mendes are looking really bad here, right? So, and even Alexandre de Moraes, people tend to distrust him more than they trust him. But look at how the image is portrayed, how the newspaper headline goes. No, Moraes is the minister with the most positive image, and people really push the narrative, my friend. Another important thing, almost half of Brazilians see a judicial dictatorship. Here, let's take a look at the whole survey. I think it's better to look at the entire survey here. So here it is. Yeah, let's start right from the beginning. Yeah, here's the survey. The first thing is whether people trust the institutions or not, right? And as expected, people distrust the Supreme Court more than they trust it. So 51% distrust, 49% trust, right? Congress has a very low score here. Why? Because Congress is making a lot of mistakes, especially Hugo Motta and Columbre, right? Yeah, if you look here, look at this, the evolution of Congress and the government, right? The Lula government, here the Supreme Court is tied, 49-50, right in the middle. The Lula government is also about even between trust and distrust, more or less tied. Congress already had a negative perception, but it skyrocketed starting in February 2025. Why did it skyrocket starting in February 2025? Because PSOL agreed to vote for amnesty, Hugo Motta and Columbre gave up on voting for amnesty. Of course, this threw Congress into everyone's distrust. No one trusts Congress anymore, right? A bunch of sellouts, right? And the perception of the Supreme Court, 51.3% don't trust, 48.5% do. Here we also have trust in the Supreme Court. The time series also shows that it goes back and forth. There isn't much of a difference, right? And what's most interesting is that if you look here at the breakdown by factors like gender, educational level, age, man, it almost exactly matches the proportion of Bolsonaro voters and Lula voters. In other words, men trust the Supreme Court less, women trust the Supreme Court more. People with only elementary education trust the Supreme Court the most, while those with high school and higher education don't trust the Supreme Court. As for age, young people already don't trust, but it's the older people, only the elderly, who trust the Supreme Court more. Why is that? Because it's that thing about people who watch television. People who are used to watching television and so on, even among the young here, look, there's already a majority who don't trust compared to those who do, even if it's a small difference. People in middle age here, in their working life, right, that is not children and also not in the last stage of life, these people distrust the Supreme Court more, right? Older people trust the Supreme Court, but why is that? Because they're the ones who watch Read a Globo. Anyway, it's the same situation, the same pattern here with the regions. The Northeast and the North are the ones who trust the Supreme Court the most, while the Southeast, South, and Center West are the ones who distrust the Supreme Court. In other words, it's the exact pattern of Brazil's current division between people who vote for Lula and people who vote for Bolsonaro, and it's precisely about decentralized and distributed information. That's what I keep telling you. Who is it that votes for Lula? It's the people who are still stuck watching television. And who doesn't vote for Lula anymore? It's the people who are on the internet, who are on social media. And I'm telling you, that's why why Bolsonarism still has a lot of room to grow, right? Look, we're managing to keep it about 50-50 because we're under heavy attack, right? I mean, the media is constantly going after Bolsonaro. They won't be able to keep up this pace for much longer, right? As time goes by, more people go to social media, more people realize the illusion of traditional media, and more people move to the right and abandon the left. That's the problem that causes all of this, right? Why is the left so terrified? Why do they want to destroy Bolsonaro at any cost? Because of this right here, right? Here, look, how do you evaluate the performance of the Supreme Court ministers in each of these areas? When it comes to defending democracy, more people rate them negatively as terrible than positively. If the ministers wanted to sell the idea that they were defending democracy, they're not. Everyone knows that they are quote-unquote defending quote-unquote democracy. In other words, they're actually implementing a dictatorship, right? Respect for the Constitution and the laws. The Supreme Court is seen as an institution that does not respect the Constitution and the laws. Everything here ends up being bad in the end for the Supreme Court. Yeah, the Supreme Court is seen as something very negative by most Brazilians, right? Are most Supreme Court justices currently demonstrating competence and impartiality in judging cases before the court? Some people think not, right? Anyway, here the division is the same story. Yeah, here, look. In your opinion, is Brazil currently living under a judicial dictatorship? Yes, most people say yes. Yeah, it's basically a technical tie here, right within the margin of error, with no, the judiciary is fulfilling its role properly. But look, there are still 11% who answer here. No, it's not a judicial dictatorship, but many judges commit abuses and overstep their authority. So, if you add these 45% here with these 11% here, my friend, that makes 56%, which is way outside the margin of error. The people who think that we're living in a democratic normality, right? Because everyone should think that the judiciary is fulfilling its role, right? But that's not the case, is it? It clearly shows that it's not fulfilling its role, right? They show here, look, that there was an increase in the number of people who think that the judiciary is fulfilling its role correctly, precisely because of the strong, massive propaganda that happened recently with this whole issue of the American tariff hike and so on, but it's still a minority. If you add this up here, the abuses and the people talking about the dictatorship of the judiciary, everyone can see that the Supreme Court is really making mistakes, right? Again, it's the same story here. The division is the same as between Lula and Bolsonaro. And here is that negative or positive image of the Supreme Court justices. Anyway, amnesty on January 8th. Do you agree or disagree with the actions of the protesters who occupied the National Congress? Most people disagree with what they did. Okay, I disagree too. I don't think that was a cool thing to do, right? Yeah, do you agree or disagree with the action? Here, yeah, this is still a big number, but this doesn't really mean anything. Everyone disagrees with this, right? Now here, look. In your opinion, was the invasion of the National Congress by Bolsonaro supporters justified or unjustified? Completely justified. Also totally justified. I completely agree. The important thing is to look at the issue here. Do you think the punishments for the protesters who invaded the Congress were appropriate? No, they were excessive. Most people, everyone thinks the punishments for those who invaded were excessive. So even though most Brazilians think January 8th was a mistake, and I agree, it was a mistake, there's no doubt about it, the Supreme Court's punishment is excessive, right? Do you agree with the Supreme Court's decision to sentence the participants to sentences exceeding 15 years? I disagree. Most Brazilians disagree with that. Everyone sees it, it's absurd. In your opinion, was former President Bolsonaro responsible for the invasion of Congress, the presidential palace, and the Supreme Court? No. Most people say no, but I agree, there's very little difference here. It shows a divided Brazil, as I've been telling you. And again, this division is something that benefits Bolsonaro, right? And another remarkable thing here, this has now become the majority. Before, most people thought Bolsonaro was indeed responsible. Now they think he isn't, right? Are you for or against a broad, general, and restricted amnesty for political leaders and protesters investigated and convicted for attempting a coup d'etat and so on? Here it says that, yeah, those against make up 51%, but it's that thing I keep telling you. It's like what they're showing here is, it's like people saw that it was wrong. People want those involved to pay for the destruction, but not those huge sentences or whatever. I'm sure that if the question here was, do you think that if the punishment could be just for the destruction and not for the coup attempt and all that, I think most people would be in favor of amnesty. In other words, the way they're framing it here is because people don't agree with the fact that others invaded, right? By the way, that's a little tip. This kind of survey trick is very common. Notice that the first two questions they ask here are meant to influence people against Bolsonaro. Do you really need to ask whether you agree or disagree with the invasion of Congress on January 8th? Of course, everyone disagrees. They ask that so people keep that idea in their heads. Oh man, I'm against those people. January 8th was bad, right? So then they ask here, look, in your opinion, was the invasion justified? Of course it wasn't justified. Everyone knows it wasn't justified. But the point of asking these kinds of questions in surveys, this is what I'm telling you, man. It's super easy to lie with statistics. These questions are exactly meant to predispose people to mistakes or to bias them toward the answer in the next question. And notice that even with all this, they can't get much out of it, right? At most, what they manage to say here is that they're against a full amnesty. But if you look, they're against a complete amnesty. They want to punish people for the disorder, for the damage, but not for an attempted coup d'etat, not with 15-year sentences, which is completely absurd, right? Anyway, this whole thing is very interesting. They're also against Jair Bolsonaro's arrest, against house arrest. They're also against Bolsonaro's ineligibility. They think Bolsonaro should be allowed to run. So, this survey is quite interesting. I found it overwhelmingly positive for us in the opposition and bad for the Supreme Court. Thank you for watching the video until the end. Besides liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel, consider becoming a sponsor with contributions starting at just 199 reais. Click the join button below to learn about the terms and benefits of sponsoring the channel. For more information about our project, visit the websites shown on the screen.